Did you know that Olympic National Park in Washington encompasses nearly 1 million acres and has several distinct ecosystems, including glacier-capped mountains, old-growth temperate rainforests, and over 70 miles of wild coastline? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about the Pacific Northwest with author Charlie Sheldon on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll discuss the tales and adventures of the Pacific Northwest with author Charlie Sheldon. But first, a trivia question. What has been declared the most disastrous volcanic eruption in U.S. history? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Charlie Sheldon on the show today. Charlie studied at Yale University and the University of Massachusetts, where he received a master's degree in wildlife biology and resource management. He then went to sea as a commercial fisherman off New England for several years, later working as a consultant for fishery management councils, developing fishery management plans and conducting gear development projects for more selective fisheries. He spent nearly 30 years working for seaports on the East and West Coasts as a tribal negotiator, construction manager, project manager, and eventually an executive. After retiring from seaports, Charlie returned to the sea with the Sailors Union of the Pacific to serve on container and military vessels. His last gig was as a bosun aboard the USNS Shugart in 2016. Since moving to the Pacific Northwest in 1990, Charlie has been fascinated with the ancient legend among the first people that they have always been here, despite current accepted science holding that humans first reached the Americas 15 to 20,000 years ago. His abiding interest and years of research, discussion, and examination of possible sites formed an idea for a story about whether and how such ancient legends might be true. Strongheart was published in 2017 by Iron Twine Press and has been followed by Adrift in 2018. Totem, the third and final tale, is due for publication in the summer of 2021. These stories all explore the question, can ancient legends be true? These days, Charlie lives in Tacoma, hikes in the Olympics whenever he can, performs readings and discussions at bookstores and retirement communities in the Pacific Northwest, and continues to spin yarns. When I found out about Charlie's unique background, my curiosity was immediately piqued and I wanted to learn more. I hope this interview with Charlie will spark your curiosity too. Welcome to the show, Charlie. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You have quite an interesting background. You've worked as a commercial fisherman, a fisheries consultant, and an executive for various seaports, and after retirement, you went back to work for several years as a merchant sailor. What drew you to the sea?
I have no idea. I enjoyed it. I guess it's hard to explain why. I just liked it. I think when I was a little kid and my parents took me to the beach the first time, apparently I just loved it. So maybe it's since I was 2 or 3 years old. And then it just turned out that my work almost entirely, not all, but most of it was tied to the waterfront or being at sea. That's what the arc became. It wasn't intended, but that's what happened.
And you've since relocated to the Pacific Northwest to be near Olympic National Park. You've done a lot of hiking and exploring in the region. What do you find so appealing about that area?
It's an interesting park to me. I mean, there are many great national parks, and I've been to a number of them. But I think way back when I was in the 8th grade, National Geographic magazine had an article about the Olympic National Park. And I remember my best friend at the time, this guy, Jim Boycourt, and we were in the 8th grade, and we were looking at that article, and it was talking about a rainforest and snow very close to sea level. And there were these pictures of Mount Olympus. And I can see the picture today, and I just just thought I'd love to go there. And then I never did. I nearly got there in 1967 when I drove around the country with a couple friends, but we didn't quite get to it. And I always wanted to get there. And so it's always been a place I wanted to get to. And then when we moved out here in 1990, we lived on the Kitsap Peninsula, which was easy to drive to the Olympic Peninsula from there, and immediately started going into the park. I've got a trail map and just started going to the park. And when I'm done with that park, I'll go to another park, I guess is one way to put it.
It might take you a while to explore that region.
Yeah, there's 900 miles of trails in that park. It's about 1 million acres. And I've not by any means been on even half of the trails, but I've been on a lot of days in the park, and it's it's a tremendous variation in a very small area. Tremendous. You go from glaciers, literally glaciers, to huge fir rainforests, in just a few miles. It's pretty extraordinary.
I can't think of another place in the United States that has that much diversity in such a small area. Can you?
I'd have to think about it. I've been in other big parks like Yellowstone and Denali and Grand Teton, and they're all extraordinary too. But this park, I mean, you can go from the Pacific coast right up to the mountains in the same day, even in an hour driving. So it's very unique. One half of it, the western half of those mountains, is the rainiest spot in all of the United States. It rains, I don't know, 100 or 200 inches a year, just tremendous amount of rain. And then that's why there's so much snow there, even though the elevations aren't that high compared to other places. I think the tallest mountain in the park is just over 8,000 feet tall. That's Mount Olympus, and yet that place has cubic miles of glaciers on it.
The Olympic National Park has been voted one of the best places to find Bigfoot. Do you have an opinion about Sasquatch?
I do. I don't think I believe in Sasquatch. It's sort of funny because the stories I write have even nastier beasts in them. But there are people out here who passionately feel that Sasquatch is here. And they may be right. I don't know. I mean, I've never seen a sign of it in my hiking in the Olympic National Park, and I've probably been in that park 400 or 500 days over the last 30 years, if not more. And they say that I've never seen tracks that look like that. They say they have an amazing odor, and I never run into that. But the believers, they believe that this Sasquatch is out there, but I've never seen or smelled him or her.
And you found no evidence to suggest that.
I have not.
Before writing your latest series of books, you did research into human origins, archaeology, geology, ice ages, and climate change to develop the foundation for your novels. And you posed the question, can the ancient legends of the most first peoples of North America, that they've always been here, be true? Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I learned very shortly after moving out here in 1990 and trying to learn about the peninsula and about the native people who live out here. I did as much history as I could and so on, and then worked with tribes for a while on some fishing issues. And it was very clear that seems to be a widely held legend. They've always been here, i.e. they did not come over here on the Bering Land Bridge 15 or 12 or 18 or however many thousand years ago. In fact, some would argue that because that would make them the most recent people in a sense, it's a little bit of an insult to be suggested, And so they say they've always been here. And I'm contrary and ornery enough to wonder, well, that's an interesting legend. Could it be true? And then I thought, well, if it is, how could it be true? So that was an area of interest of mine right after 30 years ago when I get out here, and I started doing research about it. And of course, all the modern scientific data and theory says that humans arose in Africa, and modern humans arose in either Africa or maybe the Middle East, maybe parts of China. They don't really know. And the distinction between humans and modern humans seems to be that for many, many tens of thousands of years, hominids or humans stood and had big brains and bodies much like ours, but they didn't leave behind signs of culture, i.e. burials or artwork or that sort of thing, or technologies. But somewhere between 60 and 120,000 years ago, more or less, it seems that suddenly there was this explosion of art and so on. So that was the definition of a modern human, whatever that means. And so it's perfectly appropriate to think then that humans arose in Africa But where humans became modern, whatever that is, could have been somewhere else, because the first ancient humans, Homo erectus, who have been around for 2 million years, actually the most successful group of humans so far, they got as far as Indonesia and China and into Europe and England. So that, they got all over the world, and there's no evidence though of any skeletal remains or really signs of ancient humans in the Americas. That seems to be the case. There are a few finds that are alleged to be very, very old, but they're not accepted. But of course, nobody ever accepts a new find unless it's irrefutable. So all the theory is that, that modern humans are, and then DNA, the other thing is DNA studies of, mitochondrial DNA seems to show that the DNA of the peoples in the Americas maybe arose from people who were then earlier in Siberia and came over here. But there's a little bit of an argument about that too. So the current dogma is humans didn't get to the Americas until maybe 20,000 years ago, maybe much sooner than that. And that any notion that humans were here earlier is heretical. And then if you postulate even further that maybe modern humans arose here and then peopled the rest of the world from here, that's considered ridiculous and entirely outrageous. And so that's what I was playing with, that kind of idea. Could it be true? And the stories I wrote aren't really about that, but that's kind of an underpinning for them. And the reason for that is that the last ice age, which ended about 12,000 years ago, when the ice age was at its maximum, the ice locked up a lot of the water on the earth. And so sea level dropped, and that exposed the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. It's a plain 150 miles wide that they think people could have crossed. Well, there have been in the last 2 million years, 20 ice ages. About every 100,000 years, there's an ice age. So that land bridge has been exposed many times. In fact, most of the time, it's been colder than today. We're right now at the end of the interglacial between ice ages, if we're going to have another ice age, which somewhat contradicts the global warming thesis, or maybe because of global warming, there won't be another ice age. Nobody really knows. But from a geological point of view, we're at the end of the warm periods are about 10,000 years between ice ages. And so we're at the end or the middle of the current warm period. Well, there have been many previous ice ages, many previous times that the land bridge has been exposed. And there's evidence that mammoths came over on an earlier land bridge and other big animals. So maybe humans could have too. Now, the thesis also said, though, that people came over on the land bridge and then they were blocked by the ice sheets over Canada and North America. And until the ice melted out enough for them to rush down into the rest of the Americas, they were trapped. But now there's another thesis that's slowly emerging that, well, no, ancient humans were pretty adept with boats and canoes and finding their way around in the water, and they could have come along the coast much earlier. But there'd be no evidence of that because the sea level was so much lower then. All that evidence would be covered up. So that's a very long answer, but that was what I was fooling around with. I wanted to put a story together that offered clues as to how this might be the case, but that's not, the stories are actually set in this present day, except for some visions and dreams these people have, which might be dreams, they might be memories, they might have actually gone back in time. You, the reader, will decide that. Some readers go one way and others go another way. In the end, it's just a story really about a young girl finding her way in the world, really is what it's about.
Well, tell us more about how you went from the research to your fictional story. What was that thing that brought you that spark of, okay, this is going to be a story about a young woman and her grandmother, and how did you go from the research to that story?
I had this vague idea that I wanted to do something about this ancient legend, and I wanted to do something that celebrated the Olympic Peninsula, and I wanted to do a story about a young person finding their power or strength in a weird way. And that's about as far as I was in my story idea. And then and for 10 years, I kind of thought about this and played. I didn't do much with it. But then I took this job in 2010 up in a new seaport, and I was living away from home in an apartment, so I had evenings free when I wasn't at public meetings. And I thought, if you're serious about this story, start doing some research. So I started doing research and filling up notebooks. And I studied, as you said, I studied all these things. I filled up notebook after notebook, and I started trying to structure different story ideas. And I don't do outlines before I do a story. I just sort of start the story. But I started doing outlines, and I came up with this idea that, if I'm going to have something in the park and I want to write about ancient times, how do I do the pivot from today to an ancient time in a way that's reasonable, and who's going to be the agent of that? And I originally was going to use a rebellious young boy, actually. And then I thought, no, let's do a girl, because you don't see a lot of stories about young girls in wild wilderness settings finding their power. And I wanted to write something where the women were much stronger, actually, and because anyway, so that's what I did, and but they were all just ideas, I didn't really have much of an idea beyond that. And then I finished doing all this research in 2012, and I thought I'd start writing the story then, but then I left that job. I had to leave the job. I was basically fired from the job. And so I went back to sea. I thought, okay, I need to keep working for a few more years. That's what I'll do. My wife was working in Seattle. I went back to sea. And of course, on a ship, I had no time to do any writing work. But I had my notebooks with me, and I kept thinking about it and playing with it. And when I got back from my first trip at sea, it was 200 days we were gone. And my wife had taken a course in construction management at the University of Washington, and I went to her graduation ceremony, and they also had a graduation ceremony for a fiction writing course, and a light went on in my head, and I said, if you're serious about this, you should take a course. Even though I was going to go away in a ship, I could take a few weeks of the course. So I signed up for this writing course, thinking I could benefit from this. And the first night we met, right after we introduced ourselves, a teacher, Lynn Coffin, is a great teacher, said, okay, I want you to spend 10 minutes writing something. We hadn't even talked to each other yet. And so the 10 minutes, and in those 10 minutes, I started writing. And what I wrote, almost word for word, is what's the first 4 or 5 pages of the first book, Strongheart. The book just started then. And I wrote the whole first draft of the first book in 4 months, just every day, because I was in between ships. And I didn't have an outline. It just came out. And I think what happened was that all that research and all that thinking, something went on unconsciously in the back of my head, and it just appeared. I've done other novels earlier. I've done several other novels, and they were more of an effort to write. Took longer to develop the characters and so forth. This was very different. This was almost like I was watching it appear. It wasn't quite like that, but it was like it was like that. Of course, when you write the first draft, and this happened with each of my books, you write the first draft in 3 or 4 months, and then it takes 3 years to get it right. The first draft is really rough, and you have to spend years to let it percolate and fester and move things around and adjust things. And then you give it to an editor, and he takes a lot out, and you have to put some back in. And it's a long, it's a very enjoyable process, but it's a long process. There needs to be some seasoning time, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I feel like stories need some time to breathe.
Exactly. And in the end, and the other thing, of course, was when I started writing the first book, Strongheart, I showed the first 100 pages of it to a few friends, and they really liked it, which really encouraged me. And then I finished the first draft of Strongheart, and at that time, Amazon was having this prize for the first novel, this Amazon prize, which is like you get a $50,000 award, and I entered the book in that prize, and I got all the way through to the quarterfinals before it didn't go on. I mean, I got close, but it didn't get picked. And I thought, I don't know if that's the vehicle I want to use, and I wasn't ready with the story anyway. And we could talk for 3 hours about finding a publisher and all the agony of that, which is the worst part of this. But I'm glad it didn't happen in Amazon, because the book wasn't as good. It took, like I say, it took 3 years to take everything out of the book that didn't need to be there for the story to be told.
I want to talk more about this Unnamed Lake. I watched a video that you had online where you talked about searching for the Unnamed Lake. So that piqued my curiosity immensely. So tell me more about the Unnamed Lake and your search for that.
Well, okay. So because I hike in the park, I, like every other crazed hiker who does this, you start looking at maps and you find these lakes off in the middle of nowhere, and how could I get there? And it's off trail, and you have to bushwhack, and do you really want to do it? And anyway, so there's a lake below a peak called Windfall Peak in the Olympics, and there's no trail anywhere near it, and it's pretty rough going to get there. And I said, I want to go there. And then when I wrote my story, Strongheart, at the end of that story, they get close to the Unnamed Lake. which I'd never seen. It's a tarn, really. It doesn't have a name, but it's big enough to have a name. So I call it the Unnamed Lake. So so as I'm writing these stories, there's a part of the Unnamed Lake, or just below the Unnamed Lake, there's a place called the Marking Place, which is a big part in these ancient stories. And I had to go see it if I'm writing about it. And I made a few trips, and I've never made it yet. And I'm probably too old now to get there, because you've got to be pretty tough to get there. But I tried last year, and I got pretty close. And it's beautiful. It's so beautiful out there that it doesn't really matter. But that's the point. There's this unnamed lake, and it's a big part of the story. And for people who read my stories who know the Olympics, they're going to get out the map. Of course, there are maps in my books, so people can look inside the book and kind of see where people go. And so I'm just having fun with it, really.
And speaking of maps, you mentioned in your background information that you were also a treasure hunter. Would you tell us about some of your experiences treasure hunting?
I only did it for one summer, and it was off Cape Cod, and it was with these two guys who wanted to find this pirate ship, the Widdah, which another guy, Barry Clifford, and his crew found. They were the competing guys, and they were on Life magazine and all the press and all the stuff. And we were motoring around a little fishing boat trying to snake the wreck away from them, but we couldn't. And I was just helping out. So I'm not the guy I was working with had been treasure hunting in the Caribbean maybe 20 years, 15 years earlier than that, and he hadn't found anything in the Caribbean then. In fact, his boat got seized by the Cuban Navy, and he spent 3 days in Cuba before they released him. And there was a report on Walter Cronkite in the nightly news about this guy getting captured, and they interviewed his wife, and I was pretty amazed, that he made the national news, but he got out okay. But he didn't find anything down there either.
So did you ever feel like you wanted to do any more treasure hunting after that?
Not really. It wasn't something that I got grabbed by, which people do. You have to be. There's professional treasure hunters and underwater archaeologists are trying to find treasure. But I didn't. It didn't grab me.
Would you write a story about treasure hunting?
I don't know if I know enough to do it properly. I could fake it, I guess. I know enough about boats and stuff, but I don't know. You never know.
I wouldn't want to go treasure hunting necessarily either, but I like reading about it, and I think it's fascinating. You are also a water dowser. Would you tell us more about that?
Dowsing is finding water with a stick, and people do it to dig wells. People also use dowsing rods to find minerals and buried pipes. I knew a guy who used it to find uranium, believe it or not. And for those people who can take a stick and have it pull down, there's no question that there's a force that does that. But then for the other people who don't feel that force, they're never going to believe that it's real or the force is real. However, a couple of times I've taken people who can't feel the force, and they hold a stick out in front of them in their hands. It's a Y-shaped stick with the point going up. And I will walk before them and put my fingertips on the ends of the stick when it comes out of their hand, on each side. And then the stick turns down because I'm touching it. And they get very strange. They get really weirded out once they just threw the stick away and wouldn't talk about it because they can feel it, right? I don't know what it is. I don't think anybody knows what it is, which is part of the reason it's so fascinating. And yeah, people use it to find water and to find lake metals. And other people will argue until they're blue in the face that it's not true. It's a complete it's witchcraft. It's not real. And the thing that I like so much about it is it's something that happens that nobody has an explanation for. And to me, that's magical and wonderful.
It's interesting. You're the first person I met who has done that. So,
well, I can tell you that the first time I tried it, this guy was working. We were clearing brush on a power line right away in Western Massachusetts, and we're way up high. And he said he could douse for water, and I said, "Yeah, baloney." So he cut this stick, and it was a living stick from a willow or some kind of. I don't think it was a softwood tree. And he cut this Y-shaped stick and he put it in my hands, and I started walking over where the stick could pull down for him. And I felt the force, and the force was so strong and I was gripping the stick so hard that what happened was the wood twisted away from the bark in my hands as it turned down. So in fact, it ripped the bark off the stick, right? And so there I am with the stick pointing down and the bark shredded because the force had torn the bark from the stick. Now I've told people this story, and many people just refuse to believe me. But it's true. I mean, I can't prove it to you, but it's true. And I've seen it happen with other people. And I have many stories, many stories about this. People can predict how deep the water is, which direction it's flowing. And the thing I like about it, again, is that it's a technique that nobody yet has a real explanation for. There's a force out there that hasn't been named yet, I feel. And this really intrigues me. It's just an intriguing aspect. And it may be partly why in my recent books, the Strongheart series of books, I have magic realism in those books, which is everything else is normal. It's the world of today, except that there's a couple little things that aren't really possible. But you frame it in such a way that the reader thinks, well, maybe it is possible. Right? That's magic realism.
You've stated there's nothing better than a story well told. What's your favorite story and why?
I thought about that. I think it changes. I would have said for years that my favorite story was the Hobbit trilogy, the Hobbit series, and it's still one of my favorite stories. Other times I would say my favorite story is the novel Typhoon by Joseph Conrad, which is a great, great story. Other times I would have told you it would be Moby Dick. But that's an interesting piece because, I don't know about you, but when I was in high school, I had to study Moby Dick. And we studied Moby Dick, and he'd skip whole chapters because Moby Dick has long chapters about the gear and the equipment and the cordage, right? And it's all about allegory. And I can't tell you how much, I was in the 10th grade, I can't tell you how much I hated studying Moby Dick. I hated it, these sermons and all this stuff. Well, 10 years later, I'm fishing and we're offshore and it's blowing, so we couldn't work and we're just laying to, in the wind, and I'm desperate for something to read. Most of the reading material on fishing books is, X-rated magazines, and there aren't many books. But under the skipper's bunk, he had a paperback copy of Moby Dick, and there was nothing else to read, so I picked it up to start reading it, and I finished it in about, 6 hours or something like that. It didn't seem to take any time at all. And the reason was because I'd been to sea and been sailing, I understood it, right? And so what previously had been a total burden was just a delight. It was fascinating. The switch was just very fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's interesting how your perspective changes, and also with age, I'm sure that made a difference too. I also was tortured with Moby Dick when I was a young person, and I didn't understand it and didn't know why we had to read it. So maybe I'll go back and try to read it as an adult now and see if I have a different perspective on that book.
Well, you might. I found myself, because I could read the sections on all the gear and cordage, because I knew enough now about marine stuff to be interested in it. I could picture it and be interested in it. But, that's one of the great stories of the sea, of course. And he made one trip on a whaler, and he quit halfway through the trip. So he was only on the ship for 15 months. And yet he made a lifetime of writing about it, and so he did pretty well.
I know.
It's a good story.
If only that could happen to me at some point in my writing career.
Well, I think I think the difference today, I think it's very different. I've said to many people that the problem today is less about getting published or producing the book, because they have these print-on-demand systems now, right? You don't have to set type and everything. In the old days, maybe a lot of people wrote, but there weren't many avenues to produce books. Right? Today, it's just the opposite. The problem is getting noticed. The problem is, the reason I'm doing podcasts is in hopes that someone hearing a podcast might be curious enough to at least look the book up, right? Getting the eyes on the book, because how otherwise do people even know it exists?
Yeah, there's 10 million books on Amazon now or more, and several thousand more are published a week. So yeah, discoverability of your books is a problem.
I think it's actually several thousand are published a day. I think there are 500,000 books a year published now. It's ridiculous. And so how do you get noticed? Word of mouth is one thing, maybe some internet, social media. I don't know. The jury's out. I'm trying this, but it's a struggle. And even getting your book in a bookstore, even if you're a local author, they only have so much bookstore space, right? And now that I've written... And there are
only so many people alive, and those people only have 24 hours a day. there's probably too many books for the number of people to consume in their lifetimes.
You're right. And you can miss whole sections. And then you've got all these different genres. And so people only read certain genres. And yeah, so it's, I say to people ask me, why do you do this? And I say, well, the process of telling the tale is really an amazing process, and it's fun. And it's, of course, important for some people to read it and fall into it. And you know, if someone comes to you and says, I couldn't put your book down, that's like an Academy Award, right? That's the highest praise you can get. I couldn't put it down. It has nothing to do with money. It just has to do with, you know, people liking the story. Because the other thesis and the whole, you know, as I said, the whole thesis behind these stories is that it is the telling of stories that made us what we are. And it's an ancient human-long practice that we all are wired to like and enjoy, whether it's around a campfire or, you know, in a ship when you're waiting for the wind to stop blowing, or being read to at night by your parents. It doesn't matter. It's very important. You know, you can imagine, you can dream, you can picture a future, and then try to create the future you predict. That's a very human thing to do. So yeah, the stories are important. The other thing I've noticed is that it's hard for me now when I read, and I do a lot of reading, but many of the books that I'll pick up to read, I find I cannot finish. I'm just not interested in the characters. I don't care what happens, you know, you know what I mean? And then now and then I'll stumble on something that's really great. And it's just such a gift when you run into something like that, where you don't want to put it down.
And you hope that people feel that way about your stories
Exactly.
too.
Exactly.
So is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
Not really. I've done these stories. I'm hoping people will at least look at them, read the summaries of them, and see what they like. Maybe look. And one thing I'm doing right now with respect to this series is that the third book, Totem, is coming out at the end of October. So I've made the first two, Strongheart and Adrift, available on Amazon Kindle for 99 cents each, in hopes that people will pick up one of those and read it. And then if they like it, then they might be more interested in going further and reading the whole series. Who knows? Will that work? I don't know. I don't know. It's just kind of a crapshoot, you know. You just try to, I mean, I went around when I first did Strongheart, I went around and drove 8,000 miles and visited every independent bookstore in the Pacific Northwest. But, you know, you walk in cold and you say, I'm an author. They don't know what to make of that. You know, you need to have some legitimacy somehow. You need good reviews. You need to have other good authors referencing your books and so on. It's tough. It's really tough. Plus, the hardest part of it is, especially for the many people now who are self-published and trying to do it on their own, is the part of your brain, at least that I use to tell stories, is so different from the part that promoting yourself, you know, you're trying to get out there and be noticed, which institutionally I hate doing, right? So it's just a struggle, the sort of self-promotion aspect of it, which has probably always been true for writers, but I think it makes some of us deeply uncomfortable to do that. You just want to, if they pick your book up, you hope, if they aren't grabbed in the first couple of pages, then you're not going to get them.
Yeah, the things that the traits and talents that it takes to be a writer don't always transfer to being a self-promoter and being a marketer and being your own publicist. And for me, I know, and this is true, I know for a lot of people, I'm good with words, but not necessarily numbers. And I have to be a business owner too, on top of everything else. So,
well, I know some people, one author named John Evison, who's pretty well known out here in the Northwest, and a good author who I've gotten to know a little bit, and he's done some great blurbs for my second book, Adrift, and he's going to do a blurb for the third one, Totem, and that's very valuable. But the thing I most admire about him is he's raising a family of 3 kids as a writer of fiction, and let me tell you, there aren't many of them that are, you know, that full time. That's their, you know, and that. It's really hard, and it's not an easy way to make a living, you know, and I'm not making a living doing this. I couldn't make a living doing this. I mean, if the book doesn't take off, I've had fun writing it. If it takes off, great, you know, but I don't have that. I'm not being driven by that desperation of doing that. I mean, when I was driven that way, I went back to sea to work. You know, that's the way I handled it. which worked. So, you do what you have to do. I think one fact is, I think there may be some people out there who are now writing because they think it's a way to be independent and on their own and support themselves. That's great if that's why. But I think most people who do this and seriously are driven to do it. I think it's something that drives you to do it, and because most of it's humiliating and painful and difficult and horrible. So why would you do it? And I mean, if you've gone down the road of trying to find an agent, for example, or you've gone to a writers' conference and trying to do pitch sessions, and you figure out pretty quickly that all the people doing pitch sessions they're just on the rubber chicken circuit getting their bills paid, just going conference to conference. They don't care about selling books, really. I mean, that's a cynical thing to say, but there's some truth to that. So there's all these people who want to do this and do it seriously. And then you have these folks who go to these MFA programs, which I think it's admirable that they're that committed, but those are expensive programs. And then what do you do? It's not easy. But I think for all of us, it takes time and energy to write a novel, and you have to be pretty self-disciplined and pretty driven to do that. You know what I mean? It's not an easy thing to do. And many people do it. So I think that's good.
I think for me, it's the love of writing that keeps me writing and entertaining myself, because I have no control about the outcome of it. Once you put it out into the world, there's nothing more you can do. I mean, you can promote, and there have been books that I've promoted a lot and have done nothing. And then other books I put up there and forgot about them, and they became bestsellers just on their own. So I mean,
how many books have you written?
50.
50? Do you write in a particular genre?
Well, at the time that I wrote most of my books, it was romance, which tend to be a little less labor intensive, because for the most part, they don't require as much like research, for example. I'm writing a nonfiction book right now, which is requiring a tremendous amount of research. So that's going to take me a lot longer. But yeah, when you write in certain genres, I'm not saying it's easier to write, but it's not as time consuming because it doesn't require that amount of research and that thinking about it a lot. It came easier to me to do that.
And so are you doing it as self-published?
My husband and I actually own a publishing company. So we publish.
So you set a publishing company up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we publish.
So you can do returns at bookstores.
Yeah, we publish our books and other authors as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's because the trick seemed to me to be that 55% return or whatever you need if you want to tie in with a distributor. And I guess Ingram Spark now is set up for self-published books, but for bookstores that makes a huge difference. Though I wonder these days how important bookstores really are. I mean, I drove 8,000 miles to 150 bookstores, and maybe I've got my books in 15 of them now. It's not a cost-effective way of promoting your book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The majority.
I admire you for doing it. I mean, that's great. I mean, I've written 9 books over like 30 years, and I'll go years between doing stories. It's not a consistent thing.
The majority of our sales are online ebooks today.
Really?
More so than paperbacks. Yeah. I would say for honestly, every 1,000 ebooks, we'll sell 1 paperback. That's about the ratio.
Really? Wow. Is it Kindle mostly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, there are all these programs on the internet that want your money to train you how to do this and do that and promise you everything. And I tried a couple of them, and I'm very healthily skeptical of a lot of this stuff. I mean, I think maybe this is self-justifying, but I think luck plays an enormous role in this. If you hit the right influencer at the right time or something, then it can sort of go viral. And if you don't, you're doomed. I mean, I am sorry, but that seems to be. But then I think if you build up a body of work and people get to know you, I mean, they also all say you have to have a mailing list. And I've actually not chased that because I hate to be hassled by email by people selling me stuff. So I figure, okay, if they want to know, they'll find it. That's not the way to do it. Do you have a huge mailing list that you work with?
Yes, I do. But it's been accumulated over a long period of time. And like you, I'm not that influenced by people who email me things to buy, but other people seem to really like hearing from authors that they want to follow. So you need to think about it from the perspective of the readers more so than what the things you like. And there are readers who really enjoy getting emails from authors that they follow.
Right. Well, it's tough. I'm persistent, if nothing else.
Well, and you can conceptualize it as a soft sale. So think of it as your emails are informational. So you have a lot of very fascinating stories on your website. Could you do mini stories and send them to your fans and say, oh, here's a fun story about this. And then at the bottom, oh, and by the way, I have a new book out.
Right. Yeah, I know. I should do that. I just haven't done it yet.
Where can listeners find out more about you?
They can go to my webpage, which is charliesheldon2.com with an IE, SHELDON. So charliesheldon2.com. They can go to Amazon under my name and they can see my books there, of course. Also, my books are listed with independent bookstores. They can do it that way. People can email me. It's again, charliesheldon2@gmail.com. That's an email that they can reach me at. So, there's a different bunch of ways. I've managed somehow, if people Google my name, it's mostly my writing stuff that comes up now. There are another couple of Charlie Sheldons that I managed to knock off the page somehow. But I'll get knocked off too eventually. So yeah, the books are available and people can find it that way. I'm trying to do some podcasts like with you in hopes that other people will learn a little bit and be curious enough just to look. And then you're always hoping for some one or two people to if somebody's got 3 million followers and they like it, then it's great. But that's not something you can plan for. You know what I mean? That's not something. I mean, you're running a podcast, and that's another whole thing to do. And to me, the idea of doing that, it's hard enough with a blog to feed the blog, let alone running a podcast. I mean, I don't know how you guys do it.
Well, it was great to have you on the show, Charlie. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thanks so much.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. What has been declared the most disastrous volcanic eruption in U.S. history? The eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington State in 1980 is often called the most disastrous volcanic eruption in U.S. history. It had a volcanic explosivity index of 5 and was the most significant eruption to occur in the contiguous United States. We'll end the show with something punny. How do trees get online? They log in. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.